Victoria! Look at the door.
That's not possible.
Hello, Victoria.
Wow, you came.
You invited me.
There is a specific kind of cruelty that wears the costume of kindness. It does not arrive in a raised voice or a slammed door. It arrives in a sealed envelope, in clean handwriting, with a stamp pressed down so firmly you can feel the intention behind it. And if you have ever received something like that, something designed to dress up humiliation as an invitation, then you already understand exactly what this story is about. On the 15th of September, in a grand estate venue outside of Richmond, Virginia, a woman named Victoria Price stood at the center of 340 guests, wearing a dress that had been flown in from a designer in Milan, surrounded by white roses and candlelight, and every symbol of a life she had constructed to prove a point. And somewhere in that crowd, moving through the corridor between the parking lot and the front entrance, was the one man she had invited for a reason that had nothing to do with goodwill. She had invited Daniel Mercer, her ex-husband, because she wanted him to see it. All of it. The venue, the guests, the man on her arm, the life she had built after him. She wanted him to stand in that room and feel the full weight of what he had lost. She had carried that plan inside her for 4 years. She had rehearsed it, refined it, and when the evening came, she was certain, absolutely certain, that it would go exactly as she had imagined. She was wrong. And what happened instead is one of the most quietly devastating reversals of fortune I have ever come across. Not because anyone threw a punch, not because there was a public scene, not because anything exploded, but because of the specific, private horror of a woman who sent a grenade in an envelope and watched it detonate in her own hands. Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than a wedding. It goes into what happens when you spend 4 years trying to define another person's worth, and they spend those same 4 years quietly becoming someone you cannot afford to underestimate. Before we go any further, I want to ask you 3 questions, and I want you to hold them in your mind as this story unfolds, because the answers are not what you think they are going to be. First question: what does a man do when the woman who took everything from him invites him to watch her marry someone else? Second question: what does it mean when the person who tried to humiliate you walks into the room you built for them, and the room is no longer what they expected? And third question: is it possible that the cruelest thing Victoria Price ever did to Daniel Mercer was also, without her intending it, the most important gift she ever gave him? Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because we have stories coming that will leave you thinking for days. Now, let me take you back to where this all started. Not to the wedding, not to the divorce, but to a dinner party in Columbus, Ohio, in the fall of 2009. Because that is where Daniel Mercer first made the mistake that would cost him the next 5 years of his life, and set the stage for the greatest turnaround story I have ever had the privilege of telling. Daniel Mercer was born in 1979 in Findlay, Ohio, the second of 2 sons in a household where money was not plentiful, but values were. His father, Raymond Mercer, worked a floor position at a manufacturing plant for 31 years, the kind of man who never missed a shift, never complained about the hours, and kept a jar of loose change on the kitchen counter that he called the college fund. His mother, Patricia, taught reading and mathematics at the local elementary school for 2 decades. Between the two of them, they gave Daniel and his older brother something that cannot be quantified on any financial statement, but shows up in every decision a person makes. The belief that what you build with your own hands cannot be taken from you. Daniel was not the most naturally gifted student. He was not the kid who breezed through exams or who the teachers predicted would set the world on fire. What he was, and what everyone who knew him in those early years consistently noticed, was relentlessly consistent. If Daniel Mercer started something, he finished it. If he told you he would be somewhere, he was there 15 minutes early. He worked at a hardware store through high school, and the owner, a man in his 60s named Carl, would later say that in 4 years of employment, he never once had to ask Daniel to do something twice. That is the kind of man Daniel was before the world had a chance to test him. Dependable, unhurried, quietly proud of what he earned the right to be proud of. He got a business degree from Ohio State in 2001, not on a scholarship, but on a combination of part-time work, a small student loan, and the loose change jar that Raymond Mercer had been filling since Daniel was 9 years old. After graduation, he took a position at a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus. Not the flashiest entry-level role in the world, but a solid one. He was good at it. He understood how things moved, how freight got from one point to another with the least amount of friction, how small inefficiencies compounded into large losses. He had a particular kind of mind that could see a system and immediately find its weakest joint. And over the next 8 years, he moved steadily up through that company, not by politics and not by performance reviews, but by being the person who fixed things that other people had stopped noticing were broken. By the fall of 2009, Daniel Mercer was 30 years old, earning a solid but unremarkable salary, driving a used Honda Accord, living in a clean 2-bedroom apartment, and running a small warehousing consultation side business he had started 18 months earlier with 3 clients and no staff. He was, by most conventional measures, a man on a reasonable upward trajectory. Not remarkable, not yet. But building something real in the quiet, the way men like Daniel always do. And then he went to that dinner party. And he met Victoria Caldwell.
Victoria Caldwell was raised in a different Ohio than Daniel Mercer. Same state, completely different world. Her father, Richard Caldwell, was a regional bank president with an office in downtown Columbus and a weekend house on Lake Erie that he referred to, without irony, as the cottage. Her mother, Diane, sat on 3 local charity boards, attended the right functions, and understood intuitively that in certain social circles, the appearance of generosity mattered more than generosity itself. Victoria grew up watching both of them, her father with his deal-making, her mother with her image management, and she absorbed the lessons of both with exceptional efficiency. She was smart. This is important to say clearly, because the easiest thing in the world would be to reduce Victoria to a caricature of a villain, and that would be both inaccurate and unfair. Victoria Caldwell was genuinely intelligent. She graduated near the top of her class at Ohio University, earned a marketing degree, and within 3 years of entering the workforce, had risen to a brand management position at a mid-sized consumer goods company in Columbus. She was sharp, ambitious, and very good at reading people, understanding what they wanted to hear, and delivering it with just words. Enough warmth to seem genuine. These are not the traits of a stupid woman. They are the traits of a woman who had learned, from a very young age, that the world rewards performance over substance, and had made a strategic decision to perform. The difficulty with Victoria was not her intelligence or even her ambition. It was the framework she applied them to. She had grown up in a household where relationships were calibrated against social return, where her parents' friends were people who could open doors, where her father's business associates were evaluated not on their character, but on their usefulness, where the question beneath every dinner party, and every club membership, and every careful gift was always, what does this position us to gain? Victoria had absorbed this framework so completely, and so early, that by the time she reached adulthood she applied it to everything, including love. She was not incapable of warmth. The people who knew her well, and there were not many of them, not truly, would describe her in her better moments as sharp and funny, and occasionally, when her guard dropped, genuinely tender. But those moments were rare, and they were conditional. They happened when Victoria felt safe, when she felt she was winning. The moment she felt otherwise, the warmth went somewhere that was very difficult to reach. This is the woman who walked into the same dinner party as Daniel Mercer in the fall of 2009, and what she saw when she looked at him was not a man. It was a calculation. The dinner was hosted by a mutual friend, a woman named Karen, who knew Daniel from college and knew Victoria through the professional networking circuit that Victoria moved through, like water, through a system of precisely designed channels, always flowing toward the most useful outlet. There were 14 people at that dinner. By the end of the evening, the only two who had genuinely connected were Daniel and Victoria, and the nature of that connection was, from the beginning, asymmetrical in ways that neither of them fully understood at the time. Daniel was drawn to Victoria the way certain men are drawn to women, who project total self-possession. She was confident, sharp, funny in a way that felt exclusive, like being made to laugh by her was a small privilege she was choosing to extend to you. He found her fascinating. He found her a little intimidating. He thought, the way people do when attraction overwhelms discernment, that the intimidation was a sign of depth. He was not entirely wrong. Victoria was deep, but depth is not the same thing as warmth, and that distinction would take him years to learn at great personal cost. Victoria saw in Daniel a specific combination of qualities that suited her plans at that particular moment in her life. He was stable, financially careful, professionally solid, not given to impulsive decisions. He was devoted, clearly, by the way he listened when she spoke and remembered what she said. He was decent, which mattered to her in the way that a foundation matters to a building, not interesting, not glamorous, but load-bearing. She did not fall in love with Daniel Mercer in the way songs and films describe falling in love. She decided on him, and she pursued that decision with the same strategic patience she applied to everything else she wanted. They dated for 2 years. They married in June of 2011, at a ceremony with 160 guests in a rented venue in downtown Columbus that Victoria had organized with the precision of a military operation. Daniel thought it was the happiest day of his life. He would later describe the feeling of watching her walk down the aisle as something he had no language for, just a certainty, bone deep, that he was in the right place at the right time with the right person. He had never been more certain of anything. He had also never been more wrong. The first 2 years of the marriage were not unhappy. They were functional, which, for two busy professionals, can feel like happiness if you do not examine it too closely. Daniel was building his side business with growing momentum. Victoria was climbing at her company. They went on 2 vacations a year. They had dinner with friends. They moved into a larger apartment. On the surface, everything looked exactly as it was supposed to look. But surfaces have undersides, and under this one, something was changing. Daniel's warehousing consultation business, the side project he had started from nothing with 3 clients, was generating real traction by 2013. He had 12 clients. He had hired a part-time analyst. He was seriously considering leaving his full-time job to run it properly. He would talk about this at dinner sometimes. The numbers, the projections, the vision he had for where it could go. And Victoria would listen. But Daniel began to notice, slowly, the way you notice a change in the weather before you can name it, that she listened differently than she used to, less like someone who was interested, more like someone who was waiting for him to finish. Because by 2013, Victoria Caldwell's world had expanded. Her new director-level role had moved her into a different professional circle, wealthier clients, more connected colleagues, events that her previous life had not included her in, and in that new world, Daniel's consulting side business did not sound like ambition. It sounded like a hobby. She began to see him, with growing frequency and growing shame that she told herself was not shame, through the eyes of the people in that new circle. And in those eyes, She did not like what she saw. She never said this to Daniel. She was too controlled for that. But it showed up in small places. A pause before she answered when someone at a dinner asked what Daniel did for work. A habit of talking around his business rather than describing it directly. A way of guiding conversations away from his work toward her own. Daniel noticed all of it. He told himself he was misreading things. He doubled down on the business because that was the only language he knew. Work harder. Build more. Prove it with results. He did not know that the results were not the point. The optics were the point. And in optics, Daniel Mercer was never going to win. And then, in the spring of 2014, at a charity gala for a children's hospital that Victoria had organized, partly because she genuinely cared, and partly because the right people would see her there, she met Marcus Price. Marcus Price was 42 years old when he walked into that charity gala and spotted Victoria Caldwell across the room. He was a commercial real estate developer, the kind who wore his money not loudly, but precisely. The watch was understated but correct. The suit was bespoke but not showy. He had the kind of face that people described as distinguished in their 40s, but would have been described as merely sharp in their 30s. He had made his first significant money in his late 20s by buying distressed commercial properties in mid-size Ohio cities at the bottom of the 2008 market and holding them long enough to sell into a recovery that made a lot of people who had not been paying attention feel very foolish. By 2014, his holding company controlled 43 commercial properties across 4 states. Marcus was not a good man. This is something that will become relevant very soon and in very concrete ways. But in the spring of 2014, at that charity gala, what he appeared to be was an exceptionally polished and socially fluent man who knew how to make a woman feel like she was the only person in a room full of 300 people. He had a gift for it. He had practiced it extensively on a sequence of women who would all, in time, come to understand exactly what they had been practicing for him. Victoria Caldwell was not naive. She understood what Marcus Price was doing when he approached her that evening. What she underestimated, what she could not have known, because she trusted her own discernment in ways that her track record did not entirely support, was the gap between what Marcus appeared to be and what he actually was. She read him as a high-value man pursuing her. She was correct about the pursuing part. They began what Victoria called, in the private accounting she kept for herself, a professional friendship. She told herself this for about 6 weeks. After that, she stopped labeling it, which is its own kind of answer. By late summer of 2014, Victoria and Marcus had developed something that required no label, because both of them knew exactly what it was, and neither of them was willing to say it out loud. Daniel did not know the specifics, but Daniel knew something. He could feel it with the clarity of a man who has learned to read the barometric pressure of his own marriage with the precision of long exposure. There is a particular kind of loneliness that happens inside a marriage that is ending but has not been told to the parties involved that it is ending. Daniel Mercer lived in that loneliness for the better part of a year. He noticed the new perfume, one he had not bought her, one she deflected when he mentioned it. He noticed the evenings she came home later than her calendar said she should. He noticed the way her phone, which had previously lived face up on the kitchen counter or in her purse, had begun to live only in her pocket or face down on surfaces, turned away from him. He noticed all of it. He cataloged it quietly, in the way people do when they are afraid of what cataloging it out loud might confirm. He tried, once, in the early fall of 2014, to have the conversation. They were at dinner at a restaurant she had chosen, a place that was too loud and too bright for the kind of conversation he was trying to have, which may or may not have been deliberate on her part. He started with something careful, something designed to open a door without slamming it. He told her he felt like they had been disconnected lately, like there was something he could not put his finger on, but that he felt, and he wanted to know if she felt it too. Victoria looked at him across that table and said, calmly and without hesitation, that she did not know what he was talking about, that she had been busy at work, that he was probably just stressed about the business. And then she picked up her menu and ended the conversation by choosing an entree. Daniel went home that night and convinced himself she was right. He doubled down on the business. He worked longer hours. He told himself that if he could just get the company to the next threshold, another 5 clients, another employee, another milestone, that whatever distance had grown between them would close. It did not close. The distance was not made of work stress, and it could not be filled with professional achievement. It was made of a decision that Victoria had already made, and had not yet told him about. In February of 2015, Daniel came home from a 3-day logistics site visit in Pittsburgh to find a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter. He assumed it was a bill he had forgotten to deal with before the trip. He opened it standing up, still in his coat, still carrying his bag. It was a petition for divorce. He has described the moment of reading those papers in a way that has stayed with me since I first heard it. He said it was not like being hit. He said it was more like the floor of a room you thought was solid suddenly communicating, without drama, without sound, just with pressure, that it was not as solid as you believed. He sat down at the kitchen counter. He read the documents twice. He made himself a cup of coffee he did not drink, and then he sat there for a long time, in the silence of an apartment that had already, without his noticing it, stopped feeling like home. What happened in the divorce proceedings was, by Daniel's account, and by the account of his attorney at the time, a carefully executed piece of legal strategy. Victoria had retained her counsel months before she served the papers, further evidence, if it was needed, that this had not been a spontaneous decision, but a planned one. Her lawyer was good, not flashy, but methodical, and the argument he made centered on a claim that Daniel's warehousing consultation business had been built using funds that originated, at least in part, from Victoria's family, specifically from a gift her father had given them in the first year of the marriage that had gone into a joint account from which Daniel had drawn operating expenses for the early stages of the business. The argument was constructed from a kernel of technical truth and expanded well beyond what that kernel could honestly support. The gift from Richard Caldwell had been $20,000, a wedding gift, given to the couple jointly, deposited into a joint account, and spent over the following months on a variety of household and personal expenses, including some early business costs. Daniel's attorney argued, correctly, that this was a minuscule fraction of the capital that had gone into building the business over the subsequent years, most of which had come from Daniel's salary, from client revenue reinvested into operations, and from a small line of credit Daniel had personally guaranteed. Victoria's attorney argued, with the selective precision of someone who had studied the account records very carefully, that the commingling of funds meant the business could not be cleanly separated from the marital estate. The judge, working with a tight docket and a complicated financial picture, ruled in a way that Daniel's attorney described afterward as legally defensible and substantively unjust. Daniel walked out of that courthouse with his personal belongings, his car, a portion of his savings, and a structured payment obligation that would take him 3 years to fulfill. Victoria walked out with a significant financial settlement and the portion of the business's assessed value that the court had determined she was entitled to. The business itself, the client relationships, the operational infrastructure, the systems Daniel had spent 5 years building could not be practically divided. Daniel kept running it. But the financial foundation under it had been substantially reduced. He was, in real and practical terms, starting over. What happened next in Victoria's social world is something I want you to understand clearly, because it matters to everything that follows. Victoria did not do anything overt. She did not take out an advertisement. She did not post anything inflammatory. What she did was considerably more effective and considerably harder to contest. She told a story, one conversation at a time, in the intimate register of the trusted friend, and she told it in a way that was shaped with meticulous care. The story went something like this. She and Daniel had grown apart. He had become consumed with his work, emotionally unavailable, unwilling to grow. She had tried, for years, to reach him, but there was a certain kind of man who simply could not meet a woman at the level she needed, and Daniel, for all his decency, was that kind of man. She said it with a regretful tone. She said it with the body language of a woman who had made a painful decision because she respected herself. She never said anything that was technically false. She was far too precise for that. She just shaped the light until the shadow it cast looked exactly like what she needed it to look like. Within the social circles they had shared, the consensus settled, the way these things do, into something close to her version. Daniel heard fragments of it secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance who felt he deserved to know, through a former colleague who mentioned something at an industry event, through the particular silence that certain people observed when his name came up in certain rooms. He did not respond publicly to any of it. He did not call people and give his side. He did not post on social media. He did not seek out the people whose opinion of him had been quietly reshaped and try to correct it. He simply disappeared. From that social world, from that city, from everything that had constituted his life for the previous 6 years. He sold what he could, packed what he had, and moved to a smaller apartment in a part of Columbus that none of those people frequented, and then he went to work. Hearing later from mutual contacts that Daniel had gone quiet and that no one seemed to know much about what he was doing, allowed herself to conclude that this confirmed her assessment. He was, as she had always known, a man of limited horizons. She felt the particular satisfaction of a person whose narrative has been vindicated. She had closed the chapter. She was moving forward. She had no reason at all, to look back. The apartment Daniel moved into in the spring of 2015 was on the second floor of a building near the Ohio State campus that catered primarily to graduate students and young professionals. It was clean, it was quiet, and it cost him significantly less per month than any place he had lived since his mid-20s. The building had a parking lot that held exactly 12 cars, a lobby with a broken overhead light that the building manager replaced 3 times before giving up, and a view from Daniel's kitchen window of a dry cleaner's and a small Vietnamese restaurant. Daniel has said since that he loved that apartment in a way he had not loved a place to live since his first place out of college. He loved it because it was entirely, without compromise, his. Nobody had a claim on it. Nobody had a stake in it. Nobody would be sending a lawyer to dispute it. It was his, and that meant he could build from it. He sat at the folding table he had bought second-hand for $40 on the second night in that apartment, and did something he had been doing, in various forms, since he was a child working at his father's hardware store. He took stock of exactly what he had, not what he had lost, what he had. He had his client relationships, 4 companies who had been with him through the divorce, and who, when he called to update them, told him they were going nowhere. He had his operational knowledge, which no court ruling could touch because it lived in his head. He had a phone, a laptop, a folding table, and, for the first time in several years, a completely unencumbered hour of silence in which to figure out what came next. He opened a new spreadsheet. He started writing down names. He did not take time to grieve. He did not take time to be angry. This is something I want to be clear about, because I think it would be easy to read what I am about to describe as the story of a man who channeled a rage into success, and that is not quite right. Daniel Mercer was not running from something. He was running toward something. The anger, if it existed, and surely it did, somewhere, was not the fuel. The work was the fuel. It had always been the fuel. He had been this way since he was a kid, filling a college fund jar from hardware store wages. And divorce, and financial loss, and public reputation damage had not changed the underlying operating system. They had only changed the inputs. He worked from the same code he had always worked from. He just had less runway now, which meant the margins had to be tighter. In the first year following the divorce, Daniel rebuilt his client list from 4 companies to 11. He did this with no marketing budget, no advertising, and no staff. He did it the same way he had built the business the first time, by being exceptionally good at the work and by making sure the people he worked with knew it. He restructured his pricing model, moving from a flat hourly rate to a performance-linked structure that tied a portion of his fee to measurable cost savings he delivered for clients. This was a risk. It meant his income was partially contingent on outcomes rather than time spent. but it also meant that every client who signed with him on that model was signing because they believed he would produce results. And he produced results. Consistently, methodically, without fanfare. He hired one person in his first year. A logistics analyst named Kevin, who was 26 years old, freshly out of a graduate program, and willing to work for a salary that Daniel could barely afford in exchange for a role that was more varied and more educational than anything he would have found at a larger firm. Kevin would later say that working for Daniel Mercer in those early years was the equivalent of a graduate school in practical logistics, that Daniel's approach to problem solving was so systematic and so thorough that Kevin never needed to be told something twice, because Daniel explained it well enough the first time that there was nothing left to misunderstand. Kevin is still with the company today. Daniel lived simply during this period. He drove the same car. He cooked most of his own meals. He did not take a vacation in the first year, or in the second. He attended one industry conference, at which he spent most of his time listening rather than networking, taking notes in a way that several people at the conference noticed and described, slightly puzzled, as the kind of attention you would expect from someone who was learning, not from someone who was already established. He was learning. He was learning everything he thought he had already known, but was now seeing with the sharper eyes that come from having had to start over with less. By the end of his second full year post-divorce, Daniel's consultation business was generating revenue that exceeded his best year at the large logistics company, where he had spent most of his professional life. He had 12 clients. He had Kevin, plus 2 additional employees, both young, both excellent, both hired the same way Kevin had been hired, by being the most capable applicant for a role that Daniel had designed for a specific person, rather than a generic profile. The business was profitable, it was growing, and it was, for the first time, beginning to attract attention from people in the industry who had not previously heard of Daniel Mercer. One of those people was a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald was 60 years old in the summer of 2017. He was the third-generation owner of a regional freight brokerage his grandfather had started in 1954, a company called Foss Freight Solutions that, at its peak in the early 2000s, had employed 180 people and moved freight for some of the largest manufacturers in the Midwest. By 2017, it employed 41 people, was losing money in 3 of its 4 operational divisions, and had survived the previous 2 years only because Gerald had quietly mortgaged his house to provide working capital. His son, who had run operations for 4 years after Gerald stepped back for health reasons, had made a sequence of decisions, technology investments that did not pay off, route restructurings that increased costs rather than reducing them, a personnel culling that had eliminated several key people in favor of cheaper replacements who were not as capable, that had taken a company with a solid underlying business and buried it in the kind of operational inefficiency that is very difficult to see from the inside. A former client of Daniel's who knew Gerald mentioned his name. Gerald called. They met for the first time in Gerald's office, a room in a building in Dayton that had not been redecorated since approximately 1988, and that, Daniel has said since, had the particular quality of a place that used to be important, and remembered it. Gerald was a direct man. He put the financials on the table within 10 minutes of Daniel sitting down. He did not minimize what they showed. He said simply, "Here is what is happening, here is what I have tried, and what has not worked, and here is how long I have before I either fix this or close it." And then he looked at Daniel across that desk in the way people look at each other when something real needs to be said. And he asked what Daniel thought. Daniel spent the next 40 minutes asking questions, not talking, asking. Questions about route structures, about client contracts, about personnel costs, about technology infrastructure, about the specific decisions that had been made in the previous 4 years, and the logic that had been used to justify them. Gerald answered everything. At the end of the 40 minutes, Daniel asked for the full financials to review overnight. Gerald gave them to him. Daniel went home to his apartment and sat at his desk, a real desk by this point, not the folding table, though the folding table was still against the wall, and spent 8 hours going through every line. He came back the next morning with a turnaround plan that covered 67 pages and addressed every operational division in the company. He also came back with a proposal that was unconventional enough that Gerald sat back in his chair and looked at Daniel for a long moment before responding. Daniel did not want a consulting fee. He wanted equity, 15% of the company, in exchange for executing the turnaround plan himself, not advising on it from a distance, but embedding himself in the operations. Working from the Dayton office, making the decisions, Gerald said he needed to think about it. He called Daniel 4 hours later and said yes. What Daniel did at Foss Freight Solutions over the following 22 months is the kind of thing that business schools write case studies about, except that it was not elegant, and it was not always clean, and there were at least 3 moments in those 22 months where people who knew the situation closely were genuinely uncertain whether it was going to work. Daniel eliminated the worst performing operational division entirely, absorbing the 3 viable routes into a restructured main division and letting the rest go. He renegotiated 14 of the company's 22 major client contracts, accepting lower margins in the short term in exchange for volume commitments that stabilized revenue. He brought in 2 outside specialists, a technology consultant and a personnel effectiveness specialist, on project contracts, worked alongside them for 60 days each, and implemented their recommendations himself rather than delegating to people who might not have understood the intent behind the changes. He dealt with the personnel situation with a directness and a transparency that Gerald, who had been through the previous 4 years of slow institutional erosion, found almost overwhelming. He met with every manager in the company, individually, within the first 10 days. He told each of them what he saw, what he intended to do, what he needed from them, and what the consequences would be if the plan did not work. He did not dress it up. He did not offer false reassurance. He said, "Here is the truth of where we are. Here is the work ahead of us. Here is what I need from each of you. If we do this well, we have a real chance. If we do not, we will have done it with honesty. That is the most I can promise you." Most of them stayed. 2 did not. Both departures were, in the long run, correct. In the 4th quarter of 2018, 22 months after Daniel walked into Gerald's office for the first time, Foss Freight Solutions posted its first profitable quarter in 6 years. It was not a dramatic profit. It was modest, but it was real. And it was sustainable, and Gerald Foss, a man who had not allowed himself to feel hopeful about the company in several years, allowed himself to feel hopeful. He called Daniel into his office that December afternoon, and he told him what he intended to do. He was going to begin the process of transferring majority ownership of the company to Daniel Mercer. He had discussed it with his son, who had the grace to accept that he was not the right person to lead the company forward. He had discussed it with his attorney. He had thought about it for a long time, and he had concluded that the man who had come in and done what Daniel Mercer had done deserved more than no equity. He deserved the company. Gerald Foss passed away 2 years later, in the fall of 2020, from a heart condition he had been managing for years. He died, knowing the company his grandfather had started was solvent, profitable, growing, and in the hands of a man who understood it completely. Daniel attended the funeral, helped carry the casket, and gave a eulogy that those who were present have described as one of the most quietly moving pieces of public speaking they have ever heard. He did not speak about the business. He spoke about what it meant to have someone place that level of trust in you. He spoke about the responsibility that comes with that trust. He spoke about what his father had tried to teach him a long time ago, about what it meant to do honest work. Several people in that room who had known Daniel for less than 3 years said afterward that they felt, hearing him speak, that they had known him their whole lives. By the time the wedding invitation arrived in Daniel Mercer's mailbox in the spring of the year that Victoria Price was getting married, Mercer Foss Logistics, as the company had been rebranded following the ownership transfer, was generating consistent year-over-year growth, employed 247 people, and had recently been the subject of a complimentary profile in a regional business publication that Daniel had been asked to approve before publication and had asked them to shorten, because, in his words, it was a little much. He had not told anyone in Victoria's circle any of this. He had not, in the 4 years since the divorce, made any attempt to update anyone from that part of his life on where things stood. He had simply been busy, building something, and the people who had written him off had simply not been paying attention. While Daniel was doing the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding something real, Victoria Caldwell had been doing something that looked, on every visible surface, like flourishing. She and Marcus Price had become a fixture in the Columbus social circuit that overlapped with professional real estate, charity governance, and the particular world of people who attend things not primarily for the thing itself, but for the company of the other people who attend. They were photographed at openings and galas. They were mentioned in the business sections of local publications in the way that couples of a certain profile get mentioned, not with great specificity, but with the unmistakable warmth reserved for people whom the social structure around them has decided to treat as exemplars. Victoria had left her marketing position and started her own brand consulting practice, which had grown, with Marcus's client network feeding referrals into it, to a reasonable size. She was, by most external measures, exactly where she wanted to be. Autonomous, well-positioned, visibly successful, in a relationship with a man whose professional profile amplified her own. She hosted dinner parties. She traveled to places she photographed well. She made the kind of moves that look, to the outside observer, like a life assembled by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Marcus proposed on New Year's Eve of the year following the divorce. He had rented out the top floor of a restaurant for the occasion, filled it with 100 white flowers, and timed the proposal to coincide with midnight. Victoria said yes before the clock finished striking. She posted a photograph within the hour. By the time she woke up the next morning, the photograph had 1,100 likes and a comment thread full of people telling her she deserved this. The wedding was planned for the following September. Victoria approached the planning with the same total control she applied to everything in her life that she considered important. The venue was a historic estate in Richmond, Virginia, that had been converted for events. Grand, photogenic, the kind of place that communicated arrival. The guest list of 340 included virtually everyone she had built a relationship with over the previous decade. The food was from a chef she had seen profiled in a magazine. The flowers were from a designer she had researched for 6 weeks. Every element was selected to contribute to a specific overall effect. The effect she was constructing was, "I have arrived, completely, and I would like you to witness it." The invitation to Daniel was not Victoria's original plan. It came to her in the way that certain decisions come, not as a plan, but as an impulse that is immediately recognized as having been waiting in the wings for the right moment to appear. She was at lunch with 3 friends. 4 months before the wedding, when Daniel's name came up tangentially, a mutual acquaintance had mentioned seeing him at an industry event. Still running his little logistics thing, apparently, still in Columbus somewhere, still keeping to himself. Nobody knew much. Victoria listened to this information with the expression of polite interest she maintained for anything that did not genuinely interest her. But later that evening, alone, she found herself thinking about it. About Daniel, at an industry event, about Daniel, 4 years later, still doing what he had always done, in the same city, in the same industry, presumably at the same modest level. And something moved in her that she chose to call magnanimity. She told herself she was being generous. She told herself she wanted to show that she harbored no ill will. She told herself that inviting him was the act of a woman who had truly moved on. She almost believed it. What she was actually doing, what she would not have acknowledged to herself, and certainly not to anyone else, was constructing one final scene in a story she had been telling herself for 4 years. The story required a witness. The story required Daniel Mercer to see what she had become, and, in seeing it, to confirm the validity of every choice she had made. She needed him to walk into that room as the version of himself she carried in her memory, diminished, struggling, quietly ashamed of the distance between where he was and where she now stood. She needed that image to be confirmed, in person, one final time, so she could let it go completely. She wrote the note on the inside of the invitation herself, in her precise, even handwriting. Come. I want you to see that we're both happy now. She read it back 3 times. She thought it struck exactly the right tone. She sealed the envelope and sent it to an address she had gotten through a professional contact who had Daniel's business contact information. And then she set it aside and did not think about it again. Or told herself she did not think about it again. Whether she actually stopped thinking about it is a question only she can answer. Here is what Victoria did not know. And this is the part of the story that requires me to step back for a moment, because what I am about to describe is not a dramatic revelation. There is no single moment of discovery here, no bombshell document or secret informant. What happened is quieter than that, and in its quietness, I think, considerably more interesting. Marcus Price had been building his empire, as I mentioned earlier, on a foundation that was considerably less stable than it appeared. This is not an uncommon story in commercial real estate development. Indeed, it is one of the older stories in American business, but the particulars of Marcus's situation were acute. He had used a practice common among aggressive developers of leveraging existing properties to finance the acquisition of new ones, stacking debt in a structure that worked as long as the properties were generating sufficient cash flow and the lenders remained patient. When market conditions tightened in his specific sectors, beginning in late 2017, the structure began to experience stress. He had responded not by deleveraging, which would have required difficult conversations and visible contraction, but by finding new financing sources that were less scrutinizing, which is to say, more expensive and less patient. By the time of his engagement to Victoria, Marcus Price's holding company was carrying debt obligations that, reviewed by any competent independent analyst, would have produced a deeply uncomfortable conversation about sustainability. His personal lifestyle, the penthouse, the cars, the carefully staged social presence, was funded by a combination of management fees drawn from the holding company, a personal line of credit secured against properties whose valuations he had been careful to keep inflated on paper, and an optimism about future performance that had not been warranted by present reality for approximately 18 months. None of this was visible at the dinner parties. None of it was visible in the photographs. None of it was visible to Victoria, who had done what people generally do when the surface of something is very attractive. She had not looked underneath. Daniel had. Not because he was suspicious of Marcus specifically. He did not know Marcus Price and had no particular reason to investigate him, but because Mercer Foss Logistics had been approached through a brokerage contact to evaluate freight services for 2 development projects that Marcus's holding company had a stake in. Due diligence in a situation like that meant reviewing the financial health of the counterparties. The analyst Daniel had assigned to the review, not Kevin, but a newer hire, a methodical woman named Patricia, who had a background in financial analysis before moving to logistics, had come to Daniel with her findings, and Daniel had read them the way he read everything, completely, carefully, and without wishful thinking. What Patricia's review had found was not a crime, it was a pattern of leverage ratios that were technically permissible but practically worrying, of valuations that required significant optimism to sustain, of a debt structure that would become very problematic very quickly if any 2 or 3 things did not go exactly as the projections assumed they would. Daniel had made the decision, based on that review, not to proceed with the freight services engagement. He had then filed the information in the part of his mind where he kept things that mattered, but did not currently require action. When the wedding invitation arrived, Daniel read the note. He read it twice. He sat with it for a long time. And then, and this is the detail that I think tells you everything you need to know about who Daniel Mercer is, he called his attorney and asked a question. The question was, if he were to share certain financial analysis findings with a third party for the purpose of that party's personal protection rather than for competitive advantage, what were the legal and ethical considerations? His attorney told him. Daniel thanked him. And then he called Patricia and asked her to prepare a summary document. Daniel left Columbus at 5 in the morning on the day of the wedding. He had arranged to stay overnight in Richmond so that the drive was manageable, but he had not stayed over. Something had shifted in him in the week before the wedding, some settling of intention, and he found he wanted to make the drive on the morning itself. He left before dawn, the city still quiet, the highway uncluttered, the kind of early hour that belongs entirely to the people who are going somewhere specific. He listened to 3 podcasts, stopped once for gas and a coffee, and arrived at the hotel he had booked, a modest chain property about 15 minutes from the venue. At shortly after noon he took a shower. He dressed carefully, not because he was trying to make an impression, or so he told himself, but because he was the kind of man who dressed carefully when the occasion called for it, and this occasion called for it. The suit was one he had had made the previous year for a contract signing that had been important enough to mark the occasion properly. It was dark charcoal, precisely fitted, without any of the performative details that announce themselves as expensive. It was the suit of a man who no longer needed to advertise anything. He looked at himself in the hotel mirror for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket, put the document envelope Patricia had prepared into the inside pocket, and drove to the estate. He has said, when asked about what he was thinking on that drive to the venue, that he was not thinking about Victoria. He was not thinking about what she would see or what she would feel. He was thinking about Gerald Foss. He was thinking about the conversation he had had with Gerald in that Dayton office nearly 4 years earlier, when Gerald had put his financials on the table without flinching and asked Daniel what he thought. He was thinking about what it meant to do the honest thing in a complicated situation. He was thinking, he has said, that he hoped he had become the kind of man Gerald had believed he was. He is not certain, but he hoped. He pulled into the estate parking lot at 3:15. The afternoon was warm and very clear, a September afternoon of the kind that makes everything it touches look slightly more significant than it might otherwise. He sat in the car for a moment, not from hesitation, just from the natural pause of a person who is about to step into something and wants to step into it deliberately. He walked across the parking lot toward the entrance and almost immediately encountered a man he recognized. Paul Jeffries had been a peripheral figure in Daniel and Victoria's shared social world, more Victoria's contact than Daniel's, someone they had seen at parties and events over the years. Paul had been cordial to Daniel without being close, the way people are with the partners of people they actually know. He was standing near the entrance with his wife when he saw Daniel. And the reaction, Daniel has described it with a slightly dry amusement that is one of his more characteristic qualities, was what he would call a double take of the high-precision variety. Paul recovered quickly. He shook Daniel's hand. He said he was glad Daniel had come. He said, and this Daniel noted, that he looked well. Not as a polite reflex, as something slightly astonished. Daniel thanked him and moved inside. Paul, he has been told secondhand, spent the next 20 minutes in a quiet conversation with his wife, in which the primary subject was Daniel Mercer. Inside, the estate was everything the architecture of Victoria's planning would have guaranteed it to be. The floral arrangements were extravagant without being vulgar. The lighting was warm and precisely aimed. The guests were dressed in the way of people who take being guests at this kind of event seriously. Everything was exactly as designed, and the design was very good. Daniel found the bar, ordered something without alcohol, and stood with his drink and observed the room with the same quality of attention he had applied his whole professional life to every system he had walked into and been asked to understand. He saw Victoria before she saw him. She was on the far side of the room, on Marcus's arm, in a dress that was extraordinary. He has acknowledged this straightforwardly, without bitterness, because it is simply what was true. She was luminous. She was at the apex of everything she had built toward. She looked, in that moment, like the protagonist of the story she had written for herself, and he watched her for a moment with the particular clarity of a person who has reached a sufficient distance from something to see it without distortion. Then she turned in his direction, and he watched the sequence move across her face, the way weather moves across an open field, visible from a distance, the progression clear and inevitable, the glance, the half recognition, the full recognition, and then what he has described as something that had no name he could find for it. Not shock exactly, Not the specific expression of someone confronting a fear, more like the expression of someone whose model of a situation has just been revised by data it did not contain and is running a rapid and uncomfortable recalculation. She excused herself from Marcus. She crossed the room. Her movement was controlled. She was, as always, controlled. But Daniel has said that in the 15 feet of distance she covered between where she had been standing and where he was standing at the bar, he could see that the control was costing her something it had not cost her before. She arrived at his side, looked at him, and said his name. Then you came. And Daniel, who had spent 4 years becoming someone who did not need the last word or the winning line, said simply, "You invited me." 3 words. She did not have an immediate response to 3 words like that, delivered by a man who looked and stood the way Daniel looked and stood in that moment she recovered. She asked about his work. She asked in the careful, slightly distanced way of someone who is asking a question they are not entirely sure they want answered. And Daniel told her. He did not perform it. He did not frame it for effect or deploy it as a trophy. He spoke about the company the way he spoke about everything. In practical terms, with the specificity of someone who knows the details because they lived them, not because they were told them. Revenue figures, employee count, regional footprint, growth trajectory. He said it without triumph. He said it the way you tell someone the truth, when the truth happens to be inconvenient for the story they have been carrying around about you. The people near them at the bar, including Paul and his wife, who had maneuvered to within conversational range, with the practiced naturalness of people who are very interested in something and attempting to seem otherwise, heard enough of it to understand what was happening. What was happening was not a scene. It was not dramatic in the conventional sense. It was something quieter and, in its quietness, considerably more devastating. A man standing at a bar, telling a woman who had once defined his worth in terms of insufficiency, what he had built while she was not watching. Then Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the envelope. He placed it on the bar beside her glass. He spoke briefly and precisely about what it contained and why he had brought it. He told her that through his company's due diligence process, he had come across information regarding Marcus's business operations that he believed she had a right to know before she signed anything. Any right, marriage documentation, any shared financial instruments, anything that would formally bind her interests to his. He said it was not his intention to interfere in her choices. He said he was not interested in her decisions, only in ensuring she made them with complete information. He placed the business card of his attorney, who could provide the full documentation, beside the envelope, and then he picked up his drink, and, with a politeness that was entirely genuine, and a composure that was entirely earned, returned his attention to the room. Victoria stood at the bar for a full 90 seconds. Paul later described watching her stand there as one of the more memorable things he had seen at an event in several years. She did not move. She did not open the envelope. She did not immediately reach for the business card. She just stood there in her extraordinary dress, in the perfectly lit room she had designed, and appeared to be conducting some very significant internal negotiation. And then, slowly, he watched it happen. She picked up the business card. She put it in the small clutch she was carrying. She smoothed her dress. She took a long breath. And she walked back across the room toward Marcus, with the total, unbroken surface composure of a woman who had survived things nobody else in that room would ever fully understand. She was extraordinary at this. She always had been. The document that Daniel placed on that bar was 14 pages long and had been prepared with the same methodical precision that characterized everything that came out of Daniel's operation. It was not accusatory. It was not emotional. It was a financial analysis, a clear-eyed, carefully sourced review of the publicly available information and due diligence findings related to Marcus Price's holding company and its associated entities. What it showed was not fraud. What it showed was a debt structure that was, in Patricia's precise language, materially unsustainable under any reasonable projection of market performance over the following 24 months. The specifics were these. Marcus's holding company held interests in 27 commercial properties across 4 states. Of those 27 properties, 11 were profitable at the operating level. 8 were cash flow neutral, covering their financing costs but generating nothing additional. 8 were cash flow negative, requiring capital contributions from the holding company to service their debt obligations. The holding company was financing those capital contributions through a revolving credit facility that was itself secured against the most valuable properties in the portfolio, creating a circular dependency that was functioning currently only because the lenders had agreed to 2 covenant modifications in the previous 14 months. A third modification, which Marcus had informally requested and which the primary lender had not formally responded to, had been noted in the documents Patricia had reviewed. Additionally, there was a lawsuit, filed 8 months earlier, in federal court, by a former development partner of Marcus's, who alleged that Marcus had misrepresented the financial condition of a joint venture. At the time of the partner's exit from that venture, specifically, that Marcus had withheld information about a pending legal judgment against one of the joint venture's properties that had materially affected the value of what the partner had agreed to sell his interest for. The lawsuit was not widely known. It had not been covered in the local press, but it was public record, which meant it was findable by anyone who looked carefully enough. Patricia had looked carefully enough. The document did not tell Victoria what to do. It did not suggest conclusions. It simply presented the information, with sources cited, and included the contact information for Daniel's attorney, who could walk her through any part of it she wished to understand in more detail. It was, in its way, one of the most considerate things anyone had ever done for Victoria Caldwell, and the specific person who had done it was the one she had invited to her wedding, specifically to occupy the role of the man she had beaten. Victoria did not contact Daniel's attorney on the day of the wedding, or the day after, or the week after. She married Marcus Price on the 15th of September as planned, in the estate venue, with the 340 guests, in the dress from Milan, under the weight of what she now knew and had chosen, for reasons that are ultimately hers to understand, to proceed with anyway. Whatever calculation she made in the days between Daniel placing that envelope on the bar and the ceremony itself, she made it privately, with the total interiority that was Victoria's most consistent characteristic. 6 weeks after the wedding, she called Daniel's attorney. The attorney's records, which he shared with Daniel and which Daniel has given permission to describe in broad terms, indicate that the conversation was professional, thorough, and, on Victoria's end, entirely composed. She asked specific questions. She requested specific documents. She expressed, in precise legal language, filtered through a woman who had spent years working with contracts and brand assets and professional agreements, exactly what she needed to know. The attorney answered everything he could answer and referred her to an independent financial advisor for the elements that exceeded his expertise. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. What followed was a period in Victoria's life that she has not discussed publicly and that I will not presume to characterize beyond the facts. Within 3 months of the wedding, the first of the lawsuits against Marcus's holding company became public. A second followed within weeks. One of his primary lenders formally began default proceedings on 3 properties. The local business press, which had previously mentioned Marcus Price in warm terms at social events, began covering him in a different section of the paper. His professional reputation, which had been constructed as carefully as any of his developments, began the particular kind of rapid restructuring that no one can control once it begins. Victoria's own consulting practice, which had its own client relationships that were independent of Marcus's network, survived. She is a capable woman, and she had been capable before Marcus, and she remained capable after him. But the financial implications of her decision to proceed with the marriage, made with information she had and chose to set aside, were real. The specifics of what she has navigated since are, again, hers to characterize if she chooses to. When the local business coverage of Marcus Price's difficulties began, a journalist reached out to Daniel's communications contact. Mercer Foss had a part-time communications coordinator by this point, and asked if Daniel Mercer would be willing to speak on the record about any aspect of the story. The contact relayed the request to Daniel. Daniel thought about it for approximately 30 seconds, and then said no. He did not say no because he was afraid of the story, or because he had anything to protect. He said no, because the story was not his. It was Marcus's story, and it was Victoria's story, and it was the story of a set of choices that people had made. And the appropriate place for Daniel Mercer in that story was where he had been from the beginning, outside it, building something else. Paul, who had become something of an informal chronicler of the events of that September wedding among their mutual social circle, reached out to Daniel some months later. They had lunch. Paul asked, at some point in that lunch, whether Daniel had gone to the wedding with the intention of delivering that envelope. Daniel considered the question for a moment, and then said that he had gone to the wedding because he had needed to go, not for Victoria's benefit, not to prove anything, but because something in him had needed to close the loop, to stand in a room that represented the version of himself that Victoria had needed him to be, and to feel, in person and without any ambiguity, that he was not that person anymore. The envelope had been secondary, necessary, but secondary. Paul has said he found this answer somewhat unsatisfying, in the way that honest answers about complex situations sometimes are. Daniel seemed comfortable with that. Mercer Foss Logistics today is not the company that Gerald Foss built, but it is the company that Gerald Foss's trust in the right person made possible. It employs 312 people across operations in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. In the most recent fiscal year, it achieved revenue growth of 17% year over year, driven by 3 new long-term client contracts that Daniel's team spent 14 months developing. There are 2 additional offices in planning, one in Tennessee, one in Michigan, contingent on staffing timelines that Daniel is managing with the same methodical patience he applies to everything. The company was recently approached about a potential acquisition by a larger regional logistics firm. Daniel declined to pursue the conversation. He has been asked, since, whether he regrets that decision, given the financial terms that were reportedly discussed. He has said that he does not, and that the people who work for the company deserve to continue working for a company that knows who it is. Kevin, the 26-year-old analyst Daniel hired in the first year after the divorce, is now the director of operations. Patricia, who prepared the due diligence document that ended up in an envelope at a wedding bar in Richmond, Virginia, is the chief financial officer. 2 of the managers who stayed through the Foss Freight turnaround are still with the company in senior roles. Daniel has a habit, his staff have noted, of remembering the names of every employee's family members, spouses, children, parents. He does not make a performance of this. He simply remembers. It is the kind of detail that is easy to dismiss as a management technique until you realize that the people he works with would, without exception and without hesitation, describe him as someone who means it. Daniel lives in Columbus, in a house he bought 3 years ago, not far from where he grew up, in the sense of the kind of neighborhood it is, practical, not ostentatious, the kind of street where the houses are well maintained and the neighbors know each other. He has a dog, a large and apparently quite lazy Labrador named Frank, who features occasionally in the informal communications his staff receive from him on weekends. He is not remarried, but people who know him describe someone who is, in the clearest possible sense, at home in his own life. He does not discuss Victoria publicly. When I asked him, in our last conversation for this story, whether he had any sense of what he hoped she took away from that evening at the venue, he was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer, and then he said something I want to share with you, because I think it is the truest thing anyone said to me in the course of learning about this story. He said, "I do not think about what she took away. I think about what I brought in. I brought in a man I recognized. I brought in a man my father would have recognized. And I drove home knowing I had not left any of him behind in that room. That is what I hope for. Not for her. For me." Victoria Price, in the interest of completeness, is navigating what her attorneys have publicly characterized as a complex period of financial and legal transition, following the dissolution of certain business arrangements connected to her former husband. She has continued to operate her consulting practice. She has made no public statements about Daniel Mercer, about that evening, or about the envelope. What she thinks, what she feels, what she has concluded, these are hers, as they have always been. The rest of us are not entitled to them, and Marcus Price is managing, with the assistance of a restructuring firm and a team of attorneys, the very difficult work of sorting through a financial situation that did not have to be what it became, and that is now exactly what it is. I want to leave you with something that is not about Victoria or Daniel or Marcus. I want to leave you with something about the nature of the story itself, because I think this story is being told everywhere, in 1,000 different versions, and most of the time we do not recognize it because it does not look the way we expect it to look. We expect the comeback story to announce itself. We expect the man who has been written off to show up to the moment of vindication with fire in his eyes and a speech prepared. We expect the revenge to look like revenge. We expect the person who has been underestimated to make sure, at the moment the underestimation is revealed, that everyone in the room understands the full significance of what they are witnessing. We expect this because it is how these stories are told in the movies, and in the articles, and in the social media posts that get shared 1,000,000 times. Daniel Mercer did not do any of that. He showed up to a room where someone had invited him to be humiliated, and he was simply, undeniably, quietly himself, the version of himself he had spent 4 years building in complete privacy, without an audience, without validation, without anyone watching. He did not perform the comeback, he simply arrived as its result. And in that arrival, without a word designed to wound, without a gesture designed to wound, he communicated everything that needed to be communicated, not because he was trying to, because he had done the work. The hardest kind of growth is the kind nobody watches, the kind that happens in the folding table years, in the early mornings before the office opens, in the decisions that nobody validates because nobody is paying attention. The kind that compounds quietly, over years, in the direction of something you are building because it matters, not because anyone is watching. Daniel Mercer had that kind of growth, and what Victoria learned when she looked at him across her wedding reception was not the lesson she had invited him there to teach, that she had won. It was a different lesson entirely, one she had not planned for, and one she will not forget. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been written off by someone, completely, publicly, with total confidence, and simply gone somewhere quiet and built something they could not imagine? Or have you ever been on the other side of that, the side of the person who underestimated someone and had to reckon with what that cost you? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, because this community is everywhere, and I am always moved by where you are finding these stories and what they mean to you. If this story moved you, if it said something you needed to hear today, please hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely matters for the reach of this channel and the work we put into every story we bring you. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe right now, because what we have coming in the next few weeks is going to be extraordinary. Stories of people who were counted out, stories of reversals that nobody saw coming, stories of the quiet, unglamorous, deeply human work of becoming someone worth becoming. That is what this channel is for. We will see you in the next one.